The sport of professional wrestling has, since its very inception, had a peculiar relationship with objective reality. In its very earliest modern incarnation as a sideshow attraction in the late 19th century, in some territories, wrestling matches were indeed entirely shoots. That is, unscripted, authentic athletic contests. But these often ended up very dull affairs, the combatants simply laying on the mat, jockeying for position. Abysmally dull events that very soon gave way to the much more exciting worked style. For decades, the maintenance of professional wrestling's verisimilitude was seen as a crucial component of the industry's lifeblood, and the protocol of not acknowledging the man behind the curtain, the development of this culture of non-disclosure directed towards anyone outside the inner circle of wrestling's practitioners, became defined enough to acquire a name: kayfabe. Kayfabe was, for the better part of the 20th century, vigorously, sometimes violently defended by those in the business. Before the modern era, the battle line of kayfabe was only flirted with and never ever fully crossed. In 1934, a show ran in Wrigley Field using the tagline, "The Last Great Shooting Match," implying that at least some of what you saw from wrestling was not a shoot. In 1957, the comedian Groucho Marx referenced watching some wrestlers practice their match. In 1977, a wrestler called the Great Antonio made the inexplicable decision to no-sell the offense of Antonio Inoki, causing Inoki to get frustrated and begin shooting on him, resulting in a brutal beating. In the 80s and 90s, famous incidents of violence in the service of protecting kayfabe can be attributed to David Schultz, Vader, and Hulk Hogan. Without going too deeply into detail, it was the Attitude Era and coinciding growth of widespread internet usage that eventually sounded kayfabe's death knell. World Championship Wrestling despicably started using insider lingo and storylines on their programming, and Vince McMahon openly admitted that wrestling was a work, so he could avoid interference from the New York Athletic Commission. And then a few years later, he simply admitted it on his own programming. Today, we live in an era where people who call themselves wrestlers use their real names in their Twitter handles, and openly state on their social media that what they do is performance art, and post pictures on the internet on vacation arm in arm with people with whom they're supposedly feuding. You're welcome to make your own conclusions about this, but you can't deny times have changed. But this fortress of secrecy and misdirection around the wrestling industry was, for a long time, extraordinarily successful. It's impossible to know what proportion of fans were clued into the gimmick over the decades of the 20th century, but at least a percentage were most certainly not clued in. This was effective enough that news programs could release exposés on pro wrestling as late as 1984 and even 1998. This was effective enough that in the 1970s, the wife of James Harris, aka Kamala, became excited when she'd thought her husband earned a $5,000 cash prize after winning a battle royal, not realizing that the cash prize was part of a storyline. This was effective enough that a percentage of the WWF's viewership thought they saw Roddy Piper murder a man on live television. This is the story of Quick Draw Rick McGraw. Welcome to the Jobber Chronicles. Richard McGraw was born in 1955 in Charlotte, North Carolina, and was good enough at amateur wrestling to be a decorated collegiate wrestler for Ellen College in North Carolina in 1973 and 4. He was trained to wrestle professionally by Rip Hawk, a multiple-time champion for the NWA, primarily for Jim Crockett Promotions in the 1960s and 70s. McGraw got his start in Florida, but he moved very shortly back home to the Carolinas and Jim Crockett Promotions. Though as was often the case back then, he bounced around various territories of the National Wrestling Alliance. Here McGraw enjoyed his greatest professional successes, teaming in Memphis with Troy Graham to form the New York Dolls, a heel team that would come out in top hats and sequin jackets, managed by none other than the Mouth of the South, Jimmy Hart. Their most memorable feud was against the Fabulous Ones, aka Steve Kern, aka Skinner, aka Doink, and Stan Lane from the Midnight Express.
Fabulous One, Steve Kerr and Stan Lane, and coming out, the New York Dolls. Without Jimmy Hart, Bobby Eaton serving. I hope we noted that right there, and we'll have more conversation about that a little bit later on, David. And don't worry about it. You take care of your part of it. You got all you can handle right there. You just keep on. And here they come, unveiling those large bodies that have gotten them the attention of the entire wrestling world. We're ready now. Just just about for the official introduction for our next match, which is going to be an end.
Jim Cornette and Arn Anderson have both told the amusing story that when McGraw went to a territory to work, depending on the weather favorability, he often wouldn't even bother getting a hotel or apartment. He'd just go live on the beach. Cornette notes that McGraw subscribed to an old rule in wrestling in those days. If you're going to be late to a show, be very late. Show up right when the bell was ringing, because then the promoters weren't angry with you, they were just relieved to see you. Arn describes McGraw working the Pensacola territory, and once the show was over, he'd head out to the bar with the boys, and when they were done, he'd head down to the beach, set up his lounge chair in a cooler, throw a towel down, and sleep whatever was left of the night. In the morning, he'd take a shower in the bathhouse, throw on a coat of oil, and start his day. Arn asked him if it bothered him being homeless, and McGraw responded, "Once the sun's up, it's all gravy." Now, McGraw won multiple titles in this era, including the IWA International Tag titles, the WWA World Tag titles, and the NWA Alabama Heavyweight title. Besides being managed by Jimmy Hart, Arnold Scanlon managed McGraw briefly during his first foray into wrestling for the McMahons, in this case the WWF, owned by Vince McMahon Sr. It was during this time in the WWF that McGraw also teamed with Andre the Giant for a time, possibly just for the amusing visual as McGraw stood a modest 5'7". In 1980, he took part in the World Wrestling Federation's Showdown at Shea, a wrestling show attended by 37,000 fans in the home of the New York Mets, an event that ought to be considered as the embryonic version of WrestleMania. In the sixth match of the night, McGraw lost to Greg Gagne in a contest that went 15 minutes. That 15 minutes should probably give us a clue about how the company felt about McGraw's talents at the time. This show also featured, for you true historians, Andre the Giant defeating Hulk Hogan on the 10th match of the card. 3 matches went on after Hogan and Andre, kind of a stunning fact given their main event at Mania 3 7 years later. Hogan actually slammed Andre at this Showdown at Shea event, generally considered to be the shoot first time that actually happened. In spite of his relatively high profile and getting the chance to work some big shows, like Steve Kern and Special Delivery Jones, or Curt Hawkins and Tyler Breeze in the modern era, in the WWF, McGraw was used primarily as a jobber to the stars. He would generally defeat true enhancement talent, but his primary role in the company was to put over heels who were on their way to a confrontation with the champion, be that Bob Backlund or later Hulk Hogan. McGraw was indisputably very good at this, as he successfully sold and put over an angle where his neck was broken by Killer Khan during a match. According to Greg the Hammer Valentine, McGraw was well liked and respected in the locker room, and counted Hulk Hogan among his close friends. McGraw once joked to Bobby the Brain Heenan that he wanted to change his last name to Boring, so that when his match was bad and the fans started chanting Boring, the promoters would think he was getting over. It was also well known that McGraw was in the grips of a fairly serious drug problem. According to both Valentine and Bret Hart, it was not uncommon to see McGraw taking handfuls of pills and ending up passed out face down in his dinner while out at a restaurant. Worker protections is of course an ever-prevalent cultural issue worldwide, and people's attitudes towards it point to a fundamental tension in a capitalist economy. That is to say, what is the proper balance between entirely free markets and protections for labor? Opinions on this range between the extremes of total socialism and government control of all resources on one hand, and on the other hand, an absolute libertarian free-for-all where there are no overarching regulatory bodies. I would suggest the gradual course of American history suggests a general trend towards greater and more robust regulatory agencies, and this is nowhere more true than in the realm of professional sports and regulations around drug testing. I would suggest that the general idea throughout most of the 20th century was a hands-off approach to where it was thought to be up to the individual athlete to protect themselves and their bodies. If you wanted to ruin your health with drugs, that was your business, and we would employ you as long as you could perform at a high level, regardless of what you had to ingest to get there. This all changed in the last 2 decades of the century. Non-prescribed steroids were made illegal, but there was still no mandatory drug testing in major sports. Then NFL defensive end Lyle Alzado revealed that the performance-enhancing drugs he'd been taking during his career were going to kill him, and kill him they did. Then came Vince McMahon's steroid trial in the early 1990s, and a tragic one-after-another series of wrestlers from the WWF's golden age dying far too young, culminating in the murder-suicide of Chris Benoit and his immediate family. The cultural zeitgeist began to embrace the idea that, in certain instances, it was a public good to protect people from their own behavior. Now, every major sport tests for drugs and has some protocol for dealing with concussions. Now, we could certainly argue the efficacy of these measures, but what is inarguable is that Rick McGraw worked and lived before these measures were ever even a consideration, let alone established law. McGraw's untimely death would come before any of these events, and as such might have served as a canary in the coal mine for wrestlers' behavior. But again, according to Valentine, his death was considered a tragic accident. Now, I find this choice of words to be very interesting from Valentine, as tragic accidents are generally not predictable, not the result of one's own conduct. If something is accidental, perhaps you could have taken steps to prevent it, but it's not necessarily a direct result of your behavior, which is probably how one would characterize McGraw's death in the modern era. McGraw's drug of choice was a prescription sedative called Placidil. It was developed by Pfizer in the 1950s as a treatment for insomnia, but was heavily overprescribed in the late 70s and early 1980s. By the 90s, it had been replaced entirely by other far safer alternatives, as doctors had become aware of both Placidil's extreme danger of overdose and its extremely highly addictive properties. It is entirely possible that McGraw's addiction to the drug began as a legitimate prescription, and that his abuse of it later was exacerbated by living the lifestyle of a pro wrestler in that era when the culture around substance abuse was fairly permissive. Given the culture around such things at the time, it is likely that McGraw at least dabbled in steroids as well. Good comparisons for his physique would seem to me to be Eddie Guerrero or the Dynamite Kid. Short, athletic workers who also carried an inordinate level of muscle mass for their relatively petite frames. In late 1985, Rick McGraw was recently married and had recently become a father when he did an angle with Roddy Piper on the October 26th episode of WWF Championship Wrestling. He appeared on Piper's talk show segment, The Piper's Pit, with the Rowdy One and his bodyguard, Cowboy Bob Orton. This was an excellent 2-minute setup for a fight. As is characteristic for the promo style of the time, it's a little awkward and they trip over their words and step on each other a few times, but it's organic and unpredictable, and the imminent threat of violence lends to it an electricity that is just lacking from the stale, scripted promo style of today. Piper is one of the best talkers in history, and McGraw holds his own as a soft-spoken, no-nonsense type. Here there are shades of Conor McGregor and Nate Diaz's promos on each other. Eventually, McGraw calls Piper out for never wrestling on television. Piper challenges him to a TV match, and McGraw slaps him in the face and leaves, as Piper flips out and tries to go after him, only to be held back by Cowboy Bob as the crowd goes wild. This was a setup for a match that would take place the following week, on the November 2nd edition of Championship Wrestling. The match began with McGraw already in the ring wearing one of Piper's Hot Rod shirts. During his entrance, Piper keeps saying, "I'm going to show you why they don't let me wrestle on TV." As Piper gets in the ring, McGraw tears the shirt off, blows his nose on it, and throws it in Piper's face. Now, what follows is mostly a brutal beatdown, one of the more violent TV matches of the era. Paradoxically, it's fairly tame by modern extreme wrestling match standards, but looks much more like a realistic one-sided beatdown of a physical fight for that fact. McGraw got in a small comeback, but after that, Piper just destroys him, not even bothering to go for pins. After a swinging neckbreaker and 2 DDTs, the match was over. Victory for Piper via technical knockout. As he was leaving the ring, McGraw's broken body is still laying there in the ring, and Piper yells at a TV camera, "That's why they don't let me wrestle on TV." Now, this was a fine wrestling angle, excellent even. It would be hard to discern now whether this was supposed to lead to a feud between the two, or whether it was just a one-off ass-kicking by Piper, or whether it was even intended as a subtle jab at Jim Crockett Promotions, which was much more willing, always, to put its top stars wrestling on free television than was the World Wrestling Federation. The reason it would be hard to determine if this was supposed to be the start of a feud was that this match aired on television on November 2nd, 1985. McGraw died of a heart attack on November 1st, 1985. He was 30 years old. It may seem strange in the modern era of mostly all-live television for a man to have a heart attack the day before his final televised match. But McGraw and Piper's match actually occurred on October 22nd, a full 9 days before his death. McGraw, in fact, had 3 matches in this 9 days, with the Spoiler, Randy Savage, and Iron Mike Sharp. In 1938, famed director Orson Welles narrated an episode of the Mercury Theater on the Air, based on H.G. Wells' novel The War of the Worlds. Wells performed this piece in a cinema verite mockumentary style, as if it were simply a news broadcast, telling the story of a Martian invasion of Earth. Popular legend claims that Wells' program actually fooled some listeners into thinking it was actually happening, that an actual Martian invasion was taking place. It has been disputed the degree to which this was actually the case, but in this wrestling match 5 decades later, Roddy Piper inadvertently pulled an Orson Welles on the wrestling fan base. There was a non-zero percentage of wrestling fans who believed that Roddy Piper had killed Rick McGraw in the ring. This may seem hard to comprehend in the internet era when news travels at light speed. If a wrestler died today, fans would know within minutes of the news breaking, and they'd have the cause of death likely within hours. In 1985, news traveled much more slowly, and there were no TV taping spoilers to let us know that the match had actually occurred 10 days previously, and McGraw had wrestled 3 matches in the interim. I also found some guy on a message board claiming that the Aftermags, i.e. Pro Wrestling Insider, heavily implied that Piper had killed McGraw, though I'm not able to independently confirm this. This was also just 3 years after the famous Boom Boom Mancini vs. Dooku Kim boxing match, where Mancini won in the 14th round by technical knockout, and Dooku Kim would collapse moments after the fight and die 4 days later. Back in the kayfabe era, when wrestling was booked more like a sport, the boxing and wrestling fandoms would have shared a substantial portion of their fan base, and this event would have been fresh in people's minds. It's not a stretch to say that fans likely thought Rick McGraw was probably the latest Dooku Kim. In reality, McGraw had sustained no injuries at all in his match with Piper, in spite of its violent appearance, and fans believing that he had was entirely due to McGraw's excellent selling. His last accomplishment in wrestling had been to convince the viewing public that Roddy Piper had beaten him to death with his bare hands. It was not widely publicized due to the rules of kayfabe, but the WWF ran a show to benefit McGraw's family in his hometown after his passing, and the show was headlined by Roddy Piper himself. Some speculate that McMahon was interested in running the show because it was in the front yard of Jim Crockett Promotions, but it is a fact that McGraw's family did receive the show's proceeds. It is interesting to me that the Piper match was aired in spite of McGraw's death. I think indisputably in the modern era, it would have been cut from the broadcast. I find it hard to believe that Vince McMahon and the WWF brass were unaware that McGraw had passed 24 hours previously. This may seem strange or backwards or even in poor taste to non-wrestling fans, but the wrestling world has always lived by a simple mantra: the show must go on. This manifests in several different behaviors which would never be allowed in other sports. If a wrestler is injured prior to the match's agreed-upon finish, there is an unwritten rule that they ought to carry on through their physical discomfort until the match's conclusion. It's considered a mark of great toughness and pride for a wrestler to do this through extreme physical distress. The worse the pain, the more credit he earns among his colleagues, as has happened on multiple occasions to Paul Triple H Levesque. Conversely, if a wrestler happens to sustain a relatively minor injury and insists on stopping the match prior to the agreed-upon finish, this is seen as a mark of extreme physical cowardice, and they lose respect among their fellows. This happened in the modern era in a match between Sin Cara and Alberto Del Rio. The most famous example of this show-must-go-on mentality is the case of Owen Hart. At the WWF's Over the Edge pay-per-view on May 23, 1999, in the Kemper Arena at Kansas City, Hart and his Blue Blazer character was being lowered from the ceiling via a harness and grapple line, something World Championship Wrestling was also doing with Sting at the time. Hart's planned spot necessitated a quick release mechanism, and for some reason, Hart accidentally triggered the mechanism far too early, and he fell 78 feet to land chest first on the top rope, severing his aorta and probably killing him instantly. Very controversially, the WWF chose to continue the event. The show must go on. You can make your own opinions about this aspect of wrestling. Again, I can see how it may seem tacky or in poor taste to somebody outside this world looking in. But on the other hand, and bear in mind this is pure speculation, I suspect Rick McGraw would have wanted his matches shown. I suspect Owen Hart may have wanted the show to go on. Stopping it would not have saved him or helped his injuries. I don't have any evidence for this, aside from the fact that these are people who tear their quadriceps or their pectoral muscles and continue to wrestle for another 10 minutes, as happened in the modern era with Triple H. Wrestlers, especially in that era, are a little bit insane. I don't think in the modern world the show would go on after a heart incident, or a match would be shown after the wrestler's untimely death without any explanation. But wrestlers from that era would probably want them to be. How do we conclude this story? How would Rick McGraw want his story told? His too brief career crisscrosses so many important themes to the history of professional wrestling. The life and death of kayfabe, the too brief life and death of professional wrestlers from the era due to their hard living, the willingness of its participants to put on the show at all costs. Rick McGraw lived and worked at a time when your humble narrator believes wrestling was generally better, as I prefer the rough and tumble, more organic, unscripted nature of shows from that era. Simply put, I prefer kayfabe. Though it was also a time when so many of its participants wrecked their bodies with substances and died far too young. I think modern fans tend to conflate these two aspects of a changed business, and believe that the business is all around better today, and those of us who prefer a kayfabe sport are dinosaurs who don't care about workers' health. My response to this is, why couldn't we have both? Are these things mutually exclusive? Can't we have a wrestling treated as a serious athletic contest with unscripted, stripped-down promos and somewhat lower, more raw production values without horrible comedy spots, while also treating worker health as a serious issue? I would like to live in a wrestling world where Cody Rhodes can believe his father actually injured his ankle because Dusty walked around on crutches at home, and Roddy Piper can sell a world-class beating of Rick McGraw to demonstrate why he never wrestles on TV, but also a world where the Rick McGraws of the world are encouraged to take care of their bodies so they can be doing the convention circuit as old men with Ted DiBiase and the Rock and Roll Express, the way Kurt Hennig, Rick Rude, Ray Traylor, Hercules Hernandez, and Eddie Guerrero all should be. I think we can have both. Alright y'all, that's it for now. For world-renowned sports and for Quick Draw Rick McGraw, I am the world-renowned historian. Thanks for watching. Be good, kiddos. Out.